So let's get started. I want to welcome everyone to this patient engagement open forum session. Thank you so much for joining. We are really excited about the presentation that we're going to give you. So I'm Eleanor Perfetto, and I'm with the National Health Council. I'm the Executive Vice President for Strategic Initiatives. I'd also like to introduce my colleague. Silke, would you jump in and introduce yourself?
Thanks, Eleanor. I'm Silke Schock. I'm the Manager of Research and Programs at the NHC, and I assist with our patient engagement work and the Fair Market Value Project.
Thanks. So as you all know, the open forum is virtual this year, and we all know the reasons why, but we're actually having some very exciting presentations that I had the pleasure of taking part in yesterday, and a great opening session. So I think we're well off to a good start with this with our virtual approach, and I think it's going to be exciting to see the way that we're able to leverage this opportunity to do things a little bit differently. So we want to talk about patient engagement from a holistic perspective, who's involved, the landscape that we're in. We want to foster collaboration, and this session is particularly about collaboration, and it is particularly about co-creation, so you're going to hear a lot about that. And we want to, of course, break down the fragmentation that we all see. So I am going to move to the next slide and see if this works for me. Nope, Silke, it's not working. Oh, unless I just did that. Well, I'll let you know. So, so here's the agenda going forward. So, of course, we have the sessions that started yesterday, additional sessions happening today, and then here is the schedule that will be happening throughout the year. So please keep these dates in mind, put them on your calendar, and look forward to participating in all of them. Okay, so the session that we're going to do this morning is called the National Health Council's Patient Engagement Fair Market Value Calculator Toolbox. And I'm going to go through some background here and talk a little bit about the history of this, how it came about, who some of the folks have been who have been involved in creating this toolbox, what we have ready for today to show you, and then what we will have coming out in a little bit later in the summer as we begin to finish other pieces of the toolbox. So let's jump right in. Silke, next slide. For those of you who don't know anything about the National Health Council, we're a US-based organization. We are a not-for-profit, and we are a membership organization. And we have about 140 members that are part of the council, and they fall into 5 categories. And the largest category per our bylaws must always be patient advocacy groups. And you see here on this slide the logos of all of the patient advocacy groups that we have in membership. And that's 62 different organizations. And you see that they span from the very large organizations like the American Heart Association and the American Diabetes Association, but we also include small rare disease organizations. So it's quite a span of different types of diseases, and it goes from very large chronic disease groups to those rare disease groups. Next slide, please, Silke. I want to begin, of course, by thanking the sponsors who helped to support this, initiative. And you'll see that it was a very long list of sponsors, and we're very proud of that. And they all were very engaged in the process. We asked them to serve on different committees and things like that. And I want to thank all of them for not just their financial sponsorship, but also for their time, because many individuals gave a lot of time to their committee work and in the review process. So thank you all. Next slide, please. So I'm going to start with the background on what it was that we did and how it came about. So beginning with why create an FMV calculator. Of course, we had lots of individuals who were coming to us as the National Health Council, and they were talking to us about how they had needs that were in terms of being able to co-create with patients, engage with patients, but there were questions about what's the appropriate rate for us to be able to pay patients for them to be part of the whatever initiative they were putting together. So this input was coming from patient groups and from industry. Companies were asking, well, I'd like to engage patients, and I understand that I should compensate them, but I really don't know how much. What's the right amount? I don't want to be accused of doing something that's inappropriate, but I know it's also inappropriate to not pay patients. So give us some advice on what we should be doing. Patient groups would get in touch with us and they would say things like, a company has approached us to do some work with them. We really want to do this work with them, and we know we should be paid and compensated for the time that we're going to put in, but we're not sure what to charge. Give us some guidance on what to charge. And they all believed and they all understood that the methods that most companies were using to compensate clinicians and researchers was not appropriate for compensating patients. And so they turned to us and asked, what might we be able to do to be able to, oh, Silk, I'm sorry, I was trying to click to the next slide and I'm afraid this isn't working for me. Thank you. Sometimes Macs do funny things, and so if you can make that larger again, thank you. And so we all, one of the things that they said to us was, the National Health Council, we think, is the right organization to help us with this problem. And so could we do something? Could the National Health Council do something? So the next slide, please. So what we did was we reached out and formed a collaboration, of course, with PFMD and other collaborators. But we also did some work to be sure that we were doing the things that our membership thought would be the most important for us. What would be the right things for the National Health Council to be working on? For the kind of organization that we are and the kind of work that we do, was this something that our membership thought would be the right thing for us to be working on? We began doing that through a series of outreach interviews and discussions that we had with our membership. And we began thinking about what would be the right way to go about this. So we actually did a series of interviews. We did 60 interviews with a bunch of different organizations. And we looked at about half patient groups and about half companies, private companies. That included biopharmaceutical companies, but it also included medical device companies. And then we also reached out to others who were experts in the field, people from government and from academia. And we said, what are the kinds of things that we should be doing? And they all agreed, yes, National Health Council should do something like this. National Health Council and its collaborators should do something like this, and pull this together because it would really help the field. And so that's really what kicked off the work that we did and how we went in the direction that we went in. So I wanted to make sure that this group, especially with under the open forum, that we recognize the groups that were involved in helping us with all of this. Next slide, please. So let's talk about the methods. You can jump to the next one, Silka. There are a lot of things that go into developing a calculator, and you have to collect data from various sources and get input from various sources, and it includes getting market compensation data for the positions that are required, for the skills that are needed, for the activity that's going on. You have to define the breadth of activities that would be captured in such a calculator. We have to compare and reconcile the US market rates that are collected from the National Health Council membership organizations, because we do an annual survey of our membership on how they compensate their employees at different titles throughout their organizations. And this is for the patient advocacy organizations and for not-for-profit organizations. And then we sought guidance from a multi-stakeholder steering committee. We wanted to be sure that what we put together was easy to use, that it was not expensive, or that there was no expensive or proprietary software that would be required to be able to use this, that it was something easy. And so we actually settled on, in its original format, just to make an Excel spreadsheet calculator to make it as easy as possible. And then, of course, we got input from our partners from PFMD and WeCan on their partner projects that were going on at the time. So you can see there were lots of different inputs that were needed for this, and we drew from various sources to be able to get the data and the input that we needed in order to be able to do this. Next slide, please. So where did a lot of this information come from? So you can see here that on the European side, WeCan, PFMD, FPA, others were involved in activities that were very much related and aligned with what we were doing. And we could relate what we were doing back to what was going on in Europe. So WeCan had done a patient survey. There were extensions into other stakeholders because of the multi-stakeholder aspect of the work that the patient-focused medicines group, medicines development group does. We had think tank guiding principles that came out from FBA. We had an activity list that PFMD had done by a survey that they had put together. And then we also had the legal contracting input that was coming out of the collaboration that WeCan and PFMD had. So those were all things from our European counterparts that fed into this process, very important components that we were able to tap into, and we didn't have to do that from scratch. We were able to draw and leverage with the work that was already being done, which was very important. We didn't want to have two different silos of work going on, one in the US and one in Europe, and have them be going on at the same time, but without contact. We wanted to make sure that this was very aligned and that we were working together on this. From the US side, we did the 60 interviews. We gathered the data from those 60 interviews. We had developed compensation principles that we thought that would guide us in what we were doing, and we did that with the input from our steering committee, but we also did a very extensive literature search to find the principles that were out there that already existed so that we could collate them into one set of principles that we were going to use to guide us. Then we did, the work was to develop the FMV Calculator, and then it was also to tap into the legal contracts that were completed on the European side and adapt them for US use. And then you can see the little arrow that actually is blocked a bit by the National Health Council logo, where we then would be able to feed that information to be able to bring it back to Europe so that we will all be learning from one another in a feedback process. I want to stop now, and I want to just ask Nicholas if he would jump in for a minute. Nicholas served in a number of roles on this project. Of course, he was at PFMD was one of the sponsors for the project, but he also served on our steering committee, and of course, there was the collaboration outlined here. And so I want to just find out if he would like to add anything, if there's anything I've missed. Nicholas?
Thank you, Elena, and hi, everybody. So not a lot to add, except maybe that for us it was very, very important to have a coherent approach for fair market value, because for companies, it's very often a global approach that they're taking, and we could not afford having a different thing in some countries in Europe, then different from the US, and then Asia. So the idea is that's why we have worked together, and we continue to work together. We have a kind of cycle going to both sides of the Atlantic for the moment, and soon coming soon, sorry, for Asia. But so that's for us very important to have something coherent that can then be adopted, because if it was not coherent, the fragmentation will continue, and actually it will damage the shift to our fair market value approach. So that's the only message I wanted to add. It's a very nice collaboration, patient community on both sides of the Atlantic, industry, and we are very happy to be part of that project and to continue it. We are missing Paradigm is also working on that a little bit now in terms of the contracts toolkits, and come and complete the picture of partners that you see on this slide. Thank you, Anna.
Thank you, Nicholas. I would also add to something that you said, and I think it's important in that at the time, almost 2 years ago that we began this discussion, there were other groups in the US and in Europe that were talking about creating an FMV calculator. And so we were able to go to them and say, we've already started on something like this, and this is on both sides of the Atlantic. And rather than do something separate, join in with what we're doing and become part of what we're doing. And so we were able to, I think, bring a lot of that energy, harness all that energy around this topic and bring people to the table so that we didn't have numerous similar projects going on in the US and in Europe that would eventually, when they're all done, be competing with one another and perpetuate that siloed approach to this. So I think that that was also one of the important things that came out of this collaboration, was that we were able to bring others in and not have other simultaneous projects happening that would eventually detract from one another. So next slide, please. For some of you who participated in the October forum, this will be a little bit of a repeat for you, because you saw some of this then when we were still actively working on the FMV Calculator project, and we gave an overview of it at that time. But I'm going to go quickly through for those of you who don't know much about what the project's been about, so that you have background on the methodology that we used. So we said that from the beginning, as one of our principles in compensation, that the FMV hourly rates for patients should reflect the type of activity that they're going to be engaged in and their experience and skills that are needed to be able to perform those activities. And that the methods need to clearly exclude the potential influence a patient might have on the purchase of an engaging party's product. So we really wanted to be sure that this was going to be for true patient engagement. It was not going to be for anything that would be a marketing activity. And while many of our principles that we put together and the calculator itself might be able to be used for those kinds of activities, that was not the intent of our work. So the rates were going to be, we had calculated our hourly rates using annual market compensation as the base, but we wanted to be sure that everybody understands that these have been adjusted to be a consulting rate. So what that means is that the hourly rate also includes the kinds of things that would be overhead and the kinds of things that would be included in a consulting rate that would go beyond simply an hourly salary rate. And then we used historical market payments that would be made to patients. They were considered, but they are not directly relied upon, as there really isn't any insight as to how they were determined. So rather than just say, okay, we're going to do a survey and find out what's been paid in the past and use that as the basis for the compensation, there really isn't much insight as to where those numbers came from. Therefore, we would look at those and consider them, but we didn't solely use that information. We also used market information that we gathered about what are comparable industries and comparable payments. Next slide, please. So here was the process that we used. We first began with determining what patient activities are. What are the things that patients are doing with companies in engagement? And so there was the survey that PFMD did. There were stakeholder interviews that we conducted, and then we had steering and review committee input. And we created as extensive a list of activities that we could find that described what patients and patient groups were doing with companies in terms of engagement activities. And we created a patient activity list, and that is one of the tools that's in the toolbox. So someone could go and look at that list, and they could find the activity that they intend to conduct, or they could look at that list and get some ideas and insights about what they might be able to do with patients in terms of engagement. And then we identified appropriate benchmarking compensation data that's from the US, because right now the calculator is set up for only US rates. There is no directly comparable compensation benchmarking data nationally for patients per se, for what patients are being paid in engagement. We couldn't go to a database for that. So we used some benchmarks that came from other data sets that are out there that are available. We worked with a contractor who went out and found these data. They use it for other things, that other work that they do. It's what their organization does, and they are also an organization that does healthcare provider fair market value calculators. So they went to the resources that they had and looked at what might be comparable positions out there that have titles that require skills that would be comparable to the kind of thing we would want for a patient to have as they're engaging. So we looked at hospital patient representatives, marketing positions where people are participating in this type of market research types of things, research positions, health educators, those kinds of things. And then we also use national income averages as a reasonableness check. Did they seem like they were reasonable dollar amounts that we were getting? Next slide, please. Oh, I'm sorry, I tried to do that, Silke, and I don't know if I did it correctly. So estimating the FMV hourly consulting rates for patients. The benchmark and annual compensation data was adjusted to reflect that the patient is working as a consultant and not as an employee. The consulting rate includes salary, benefits, overhead, and profit based on market data. And then the total annual fair market compensation is then converted to an hourly rate by dividing the number of hours in work hours in a year. In the US, this is 2,080, and that's adjusted to exclude the holidays and vacation time. And then what we did was we used that hourly rate to produce a range of rates that gets developed for each of the activities that you might use the calculator for. So you don't get one single number, you get a range. And that range is because there is a range of these hourly compensation data ranges. There isn't just one number that comes out of the calculations to get to the hourly consulting rate. There's a range of numbers, and so we use that range. Next slide, please. So I'm going to go through just a little bit of information about the toolbox itself and run through that before we get to any examples or any case examples or dive into a demonstration. Next slide, please. So the compensation toolbox actually has three components to it. We have the list of engagement activities, which we call the activities framework. We have the fair market value calculator itself and the resources that support the calculator. So there are various tools that you can use that help you make decisions when you're using the calculator. And then we have the principles for compensation. The principles are what really drove the thinking behind everything that went into it. And they help guide decision-making as you're going through a compensation exercise. They're general common sense types of things. Some of them also dive into considerations because sometimes there are legal or conflict of interest type of considerations that someone should think about. Next slide, please. So the principles for compensation for engaging activities. Let's talk a little bit about these principles. The next one. The compensation principles are divided into these categories. The type of patient engagement participant you would be looking to bring into the activity, general compensation principles that are just common sense things, as I said, administrative and logistical, the time commitment, considerations around travel and reimbursement, if a patient decides to decline compensation and circumstances around declining compensation, and then a few other considerations. So here we have an example. And this is an example of one of the principles that you would find in this document. It says reimbursement for travel or other expenses required to participate in an activity should be viewed as separate and distinct from compensation, as the reimbursement represents expenses incurred by the patient that would not have otherwise been incurred. So we separate the idea of compensation at an hourly rate for the work that a person did and the work hours, the number of hours that they committed to the particular engagement activity. That should be considered compensation, and that's separate from reimbursement for example, travel expenses. So there's a difference between compensation and reimbursement, and that should be considered as you go through the fair market value calculator and any considerations for compensating patients. Next slide, please. So the activities framework, we can go into that next. The activities framework, here's an outline of what the activities framework looks like. It is the inputs and the modifiers that go into what you would consider engagement activities. So you would look at the type of participant that you're looking to have involved, the expertise required by that participant, the type of activity that you will have them perform with you and be involved in, what we call the interaction mode, and that is it in person, is it virtual, then the time commitment, what is the hourly commitment to the activity, the travel considerations, and then other potential modifiers. The next slide, please. So let me walk through an example of the kinds of things that you would think through in this framework. You would begin by looking at what type of participant you are looking to engage. This could be a patient, it could be a caregiver, or a family member, or a patient organization staff member. And typically when we refer to caregiver in this framework, we are referring to an unpaid caregiver, not a paid caregiver. And so we would look at whether this is an individual patient that you're looking for, the caregiver of the patient, a family member who is not a caregiver, or an organization staff member. Then we would go to the skill set that you're looking for this person to have. And you can select different descriptors. Typically, the most important skill set that you would be looking for would be that the person has the illness, they have the disease, or they are at risk for that disease. Or if you're talking about a caregiver, then you would be talking about a caregiver who cares for a person with that disease. And so this is the level of knowledge that you would expect for them to have. Occasionally, for some activities, you might look for someone to have some additional expertise. So for example, you might, in some instances, look to add someone to an advisory committee who is a patient. That would be one type of activity. But sometimes you want someone who is also a patient and has some familiarity with clinical trials. And so you would expect that person to have those two skills. And so this is where you would outline what the skill set is that you're looking for. Next, you would look to the activity itself. And we have the list of activities. And so it is the type of activity could be, for example, the activity that's listed here is presentation as a speaker. You would want someone to be a speaker, and in this particular instance, looking for somebody who would be a keynote speaker. So you see along the bottom, you'd be looking for an individual patient. You'd want them to have a confirmed diagnosis. You'd want them to have treatment experience. You would, for the second column with the skill set, you want to have knowledge about the condition beyond their individual experiences and personal experiences, but you would probably want them to speak about the patient population in general and what they know about that. And then lastly, you would be looking for somebody who would be a presentation speaker, and you would be looking for them to give a keynote presentation. Next slide, please. For the next piece of the framework, you would look at the mode of interaction. So the expectations in the example here is that it would be in person. Of course, that's not happening much anymore. But at the time that we put this together, it was an in-person speaker, and that there would be maybe a teleconference or two involved, because the person would be maybe have some preliminary teleconference just to prepare for their keynote presentation. In here, you would indicate the time commitment. In the center box, you get to the time commitment, and you would actually estimate what the number of hours would be in terms of preparation time, the actual time when they would be participating in the activity, and then maybe post-activity time. So the preparation time might be doing some reading. Some readings are provided in preparation for the activity. Might also be some teleconferences or webinars. The activity time might be the in-person time that would be considered, and then post-activity may be a follow-up phone call or a follow-up survey that might be done, and the total number of hours comes to 9 hours. And then the type of activity in travel time, and whether or not travel is expected. And so here it would only be local travel, and there's an estimated 2 hours of local travel time. Next slide, please. Then there's sometimes travel considerations. And so for travel considerations, this is outside of the specific travel time, but it might be that a caregiver needs to accompany that person. And therefore, the caregiver, that would be considered in the travel considerations. That would be also part of the framework that you would account for that as you're going through the framework. And then there might be some other potential modifiers. And so in this particular instance, we put the example of childcare or elder care needed. So the idea of this is to clearly define the specific need for which the patient or the patient organization engagement is desired, and to be specific about the parameters around all of that. Next slide, please. So now we're going to introduce the calculator itself, and we can jump to that, Silka. So I'm going to begin with just a few screenshots that get to what the calculator looks like. And so we'll just show that to you before we jump into actually having some case examples that we're going to go through today. This is the first page of the calculator. So as I said earlier, when we first began the calculator, it was really our intent to make it as simple as possible so that anyone could use it any place and easily see what was going into it. And so we did create it in an Excel spreadsheet. When we got that done and we beta tested it with a large number of people, we did that beta testing in January. And one of the overwhelming comments that we got back was that, gee, it would be so nice if this was just on the internet and I could just plug in numbers. And so it was then decided that we would move forward and take that Excel spreadsheet and put it in an online tool format. And that's what you see in front of you now. So you'll see the front page, it just says that you accept the terms of the service. And so you just have to click on that button in order for it to begin. The terms of service are very simple. They're not very complicated, but it just says that this is an estimator and that it's not intended to set prices and do all of those kinds of things that that legally we and conscientiously we needed to cover. But they are very simple things and they don't commit anyone to anything. The next slide, please. So you see here on the left, there is a listing of home antitrust statement user guide. These are just resources and references that a user can go through to look up the glossary of terms. So for example, if we've used a term that someone doesn't recognize, or if they wonder what do we mean by that specifically, they can go to the glossary terms. They want to look at the methodology. The methodology is listed there in detail. The terms of service, as I said, can be looked at in detail. And then there is a summary of the last report that was produced. So one of the things that everyone should know is that we don't have any mechanism for saving the data. It's really intended to be a one-time calculator without a database behind it. We're not collecting the data. And so if someone uses this, they are able to save their report at the end, and they are able to print their report. When they come back to use it the second time, that report will still be there, but as they use the calculator again and produce a new report, the old data is gone and the new data are there. So it's important that if you're using this for any specific purpose and you want a record of that, that you save your report as a PDF file and you also print your report if you'd like to have it on paper. Next slide, please. In terms of the calculator accompanying resources, we have a user guide. We have a guide for helping you to interpret your results. We have a specific listing of the methodology. And as I mentioned earlier, we have the glossary for looking up terms. And so these are specific resources that people can turn to as they're using the calculator in order to get more information and in order to look to see if there are any for example, words that they didn't understand or words that they wonder how we are using them that they can go to. Also in interpreting results, because we provide a range of results, it also helps you to think about things that you should consider in choosing within that range, low end, high end, or intermediate range. Silka, I'm going to stop here and ask if you want to jump in with any comments about the toolbox and before we go to the case example.
Thanks, Eleanor. Yeah, I don't have anything else to add except that I would recommend everyone, if they're going to use the toolbox, check out the user guide and the interpreting results documents, maybe before you do your first calculation. Through our beta testing, we saw a lot of questions on, well, how do I know if I'm at the low end of the range or the high end of the range? What factors should I consider? And the interpreting results document has a lot of good information on some of the potential considerations you could use when looking at different parts of the range in different situations. And of course, the user guide is really helpful in case there's a technical issue or anything like that.
Great, thank you very much. So we're going to jump to a case example, and I'm going to turn it over to Silka, who's going to walk through a case example. And as we said earlier, this will be based on the scenario that you go through. When you go through the framework, you will pull together your scenario of what you have in mind to do, and then you will use that information to enter into the calculator. So Silke, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thanks, Eleanor. So I have here an example and a rate that you would get from using this example. I'll walk through it live on the calculator as well, but I wanted to read through it before we started. So one scenario that we see sometimes is a company recruits a patient group staff representative who is a senior leader at their organization to serve as a virtual roundtable participant. And this meeting is about patient-focused drug development. The participant is requested to have subject matter expertise on a particular topic. This could be clinical trial expertise, epidemiology, or something similar. And the patient must read materials before the roundtable, which will take approximately 3 hours. The roundtable itself will take approximately 3 hours. And the participant is asked to take a post-roundtable survey that will take approximately 1 hour. And so this is the fair market value rate that you would see in this example, and I will go through it now and show it on the live calculator. Great, can everybody see my screen here?
So you might want to make it a little bit bigger if you can.
Is that a little better?
Yes, I think that's a little bit better.
Thank you. So this calculator is currently live on our website. You can find it by searching Fair Market Value Calculator or going into our patient engagement page. You can use this flyout menu here as Eleanor stated previously, to look at the user guide, the interpreting your results, the methodology, or the glossary. So here you can see some activity time requirements. We recommend that the travel time is compensated at 50%. And you can see some other things that we use in the calculator here. So I'll go back to the home page here. And I will accept the terms. As we stated before, you should have already clearly defined the specific activity for which you would like the participant to be engaged. You should also define the type of participant that you need for this activity, the expertise that they need required to perform the activity, as well as the number of hours or number of estimated hours. So here you see that I was working on it previously, so it comes up with my last calculation. It does only save the last calculation you made and not any previous to that, as Eleanor stated before. So here I'll choose patient group representative. I have a drop-down menu. I can choose individual patient, caregiver, or family member. And these information icons have definitions laid out as well. So for this specific engagement, we did request that the person be a senior leader. So we have that toggled. We can also toggle any of these that we need. If you would like somebody living with or at risk for the condition, somebody with knowledge about the condition beyond their individual personal experience, somebody skilled in public speaking, or that subject matter expertise that I mentioned. Again, if you hover, you can see any of these definitions pop up on the information icon. So now I'll go to the next page. So here we have the activity types. And there's a way to clear the table as well if you need to. The cool thing about this particular part of the calculator is that you can actually do multiple activities at once. If you would like somebody to contribute to data analysis, as well as collect additional registry data or provide registry information, you can select multiple activities, and the rate will give you accumulation of both. So for this one, we said that this person is a roundtable participant. It is saved in here in my history because I walked through it before. So you have the definition of a roundtable participant here. And here we can see that we have the prep hours, the activity hours, post-activity hours, travel hours, and number of events. A number of events could be however many you would like in a specific period of time. If you're only doing one a year, you can put one here. And if you're only doing 2 a month or once a week, you can also put that there for recurring appointments. So now we'll go to a description. This obviously doesn't affect the calculation, but it shows up on your report. So when you save it, you can have all this information. So here for a description of preparation activities, I put pre-read materials. We have asked the participant to read through materials before their virtual roundtable, and then here I put roundtable virtual, as well as a post-roundtable survey. Now I'll go to the final page. So here we have our interaction mode, and I selected virtual meeting. You can also choose in-person, paper-based, web-based, telephone. And of course, these do not affect the rate, but they're here and they show up on your summary report so that you can have all that information gathered together for your summary report. Here's the travel information. I did not add any travel hours to this particular scenario, but we do recommend that the standard FMV hourly rate apply to travel time at 50%. However, you can adjust it as you see fit. Here we have mileage, and this is in US dollars at 57 cents per mile to be reimbursed, which is what our IRS asks people to reimburse their employees. We also have here incidental expenses, for example, bottled water, food, Uber, taxi, tips, and you can add this as well, and it will come on the final summary page as a note that you have added expenses to your report. Here we have some additional travel requirements. I know that I saw some questions in the chat about when caregivers have to accompany. Here we don't apply the rate to this specific action. If you would like to compensate a caregiver separately, you can run that through the calculator as well as a separate scenario. But here you designate.
So let me jump in on that one because I think it is something in the chat that popped up. So right now, the example that Silka's running through, we would assume would be the patient themselves that would be going through this. And so if they have to have a caregiver that must accompany, that could be flagged here. That will show up in the report, but it will not be included in the calculation. If you want to compensate, if you make the determination that you want to also compensate for some caregiver time and caregiver travel, you would produce one report that would be for the patient and you'd produce a second report that would be for the caregiver. You would do them as 2 separate transactions.
Yes, so here we do have a caregiver must accompany. So if you do want to designate it separately, as Eleanor stated, you can create 2 separate ones for that. If it's an unpaid caregiver who's accompanying, then you can designate that here. That may affect how you reimburse travel because you would have to pay for an additional hotel room or maybe some more travel time or something like that, or additional plane costs. So these do not affect the rate, but are considerations that companies should use when contracting with patients and seeing which needs they may have in advance. So travels with a service animal may be something that pops up, accompanying medical equipment, additional 1 to 2 days of travel needed depending on their condition, special dietary requirements, rest break needed, or other, and here you can fill in other if you have. We also have other potential modifiers, and we get into some of the reasoning behind this in our interpreting your results document. So you can read more about that on that document. But here we have some of the other potential modifiers that you could use for interpreting the range are risk or liability, such as legal or financial risk, such as being the member of a data safety monitoring board. We also have here wages lost. We have in our description that this should be considered on a case-by-case basis, but in the effort to be representative and try to find a population, that may need to have their wages reimbursed, you could use this as a potential modifier in your contracting and your payment. We also have here care support. We've heard from patient advocates that we have assisting on this project that someone may need child care, elder care, or adult care for dependent if they're a caregiver and they're going to participate in an activity. We also have here size of the patient organization, which may be a factor to be considered on a case-by-case basis in your interpretation of the range, as well as urgency. If you've given someone a very short deadline or asked them to create something for a third party in a very in that very short time frame, then you may need to compensate differently. You can also add here additional notes that will be generated on your summary report. So here I'll click Generate Summary, and it'll say, yes, I would like to view my report. Here I can add my name, the organization, and who created it. That way when you save it, you can also add the project name if you would like, and it'll all be recorded. So this is what we had on the slide, and it's reflected here. The FMV hourly rate for this one would be $150 to $350 an hour. And this is because we've asked them to be a subject matter expertise. So they do need to have experience in some sort of subject matter, such as clinical trials, epidemiology, or something similar for this activity. And the total compensation for all the hours that we ask them to participate is $1,050 to $2,450. And in the rest of the report, you have all your information recorded here, as well as any notes. And you can save this as an image or as a PDF. Again, here you can see this is the total number of expected interactions, preparation, activity time, post-activity time, and total hours. So you have all your information recorded here. And of course, you can go back and change it if you would like. Does anybody have any questions on any of these pages? I know I've been seeing some questions pop up in the chat.
And I'll also add a few comments. I mean, the range is quite wide, but that also is because here, for example, we did put in the subject matter expert, which isn't a typical requirement, but we were just kind of showing the flexibility. The range is quite wide, and that's why we provide that that helpful guide for choosing in that range. So, for example, you would consider the idea of the location where this activity is taking place. Is it New York City, or is it some small town? You would have all of these different considerations. The issue here is really more if you go outside this range, if you're paying less, then it would probably be considered inappropriate or not compensating enough. Or if you consider, or if you go above, then it might be considered inappropriate because you might be outside the range and getting something that's too high, and it would be considered inappropriately too high. Within the range is considered appropriate based on what we know for the range of salaries that we know in the US. And that is, of course, dependent upon a lot of things. And those things are listed in that considerations guide. It could be location, it could be a lot of different things that might come into play that would help you make a determination about whether or not you would go higher or lower in the range, depending upon what the activity is that you are performing.
I see somebody asking about that, the 1,000 number. And just to be clear again, this is the total for the fair market value hourly rate. So this is the fair market value hourly rate times the amount of hours that we ask them to do the activity. So we ask them to do 7 hours of activity. So this is the low part of the range and the high part of the range multiplied by that number here.
Right. And this, it will be, the range will be a little bit different depending upon how you selected the required skills needed for the activity. Because the idea behind this is that everyone who's participating, who is doing the same activity, would be paid the same amount if they are expected to have the same skills.
I do see somebody asking if there's like a table that shows kind of these different rates.
There is.
We do have a methodology section, as we stated before. So the methodology section, if you scroll to the bottom, does have a table which talks about these categories. So you can take a look at that for some of the ranges to see how we interpret this. And then, of course, reading through the methodology to see how we came to these numbers. So and I do see some requests to look at other types of expertise. We did get submissions for a couple different case scenarios. So I can walk through a few of those now. We do have a range of different levels of expertise in those. So you can see more choices there and what it would be for.
Yeah, we are actually going to spend a little bit of time during our next part of the session to actually talk through some examples that were submitted to us. And I think that will be very helpful. So do you want to switch to that now, Silke? I know we've got the case examples and there are actually individuals who are on the webinar today who submitted these examples. And so we might be able to unmute them to talk through their own example. Shall we go to that, Silke, now?
Yes,
Okay.
I have those examples, the designations written down. So the first one I received was for a caregiver representative. So here we'll start a new calculation. And
if the person who submitted this is on the call and they want to identify themselves, by all means, we'll have you jump in and have a conversation with us. So just indicate in the chat if you submitted the caregiver representative example.
So here we have a caregiver representative. As I stated before, you can describe the relationship to the patient if you would like. Of course, it doesn't affect the rate, but it'll show up in the report if you would like to put mother or spouse, sibling, or something like that here. And we asked, does the patient have experience receiving any treatment for this condition? Again, it doesn't affect the rate. This is something that we know pops up. That companies will often request the patient has treatment experience or doesn't have treatment experience.
Yeah, someone asked the question in the chat if there will be a charge for using this. And Nicholas has already answered, but I'll also announce it. Initially, when we began this project well over a year ago, so the project itself began 2 years ago with the discussion phase. And then we went into actually implementing the project itself. That began last, let's say, January of 2019, when the sponsors began to support us, and we started to initiate the project with the vendor who helped us do this. And at that time, the plan was that the sponsors would get use of this at no charge because they had been the initiating sponsors to kick it off, but that other companies that had not participated in sponsorship would have to pay a fee. This past January, as we were getting ready to decide on what the licensing fees would be, the steering committee, which included some companies on the steering committee, those company representatives actually said, wait a minute, we don't think this is a good idea to charge anyone. We, as the steering committee company representatives, would like to put forward that it be made free to everyone and that we would be willing to give up our benefit as sponsors of getting it for free and you charging others. We'd be willing to give that up in order to make this available, accessible to everyone, and to help make it more freely accessible and usable, useful to everyone, and no barriers involved. We then went back to all of our sponsors, the entire list that you saw at the beginning, and we asked all of them if they would agree to that, and every sponsor agreed. Yes, make it free to everyone, and that they went back to their compliance and their legal groups, internal in the company, and got permission to do that. So again, thank you to all of our sponsors for doing that, because now this is going to be available on our website, and everyone will be able to use it without charge.
Great, thank you. I see there's a couple questions in there as well, asking if we'll answer some of the specific questions in the chat later, and we'll walk through a couple examples and then focus on some of those other questions. For this one, I have that it's a confirmed diagnosis, the person has treatment experience, and they are a caregiver to someone living with or at risk for the condition. They also designated that the person has knowledge about the condition beyond the individual personal experience. So maybe they're in a group with other caregivers, or they run a Facebook group that compiles information about it, or maybe they contribute to a registry or something like that. So here we'll go back to the activity time requirements table. And we'll say this person is asked to give a presentation as a speaker and give a testimonial. And we have here in the definition that it's usually a small or medium-sized group. It could be a larger group, but it's typically a short presentation. And the amount of hours I have here in the pre-activity hours, we have take a short survey, so that'll be 1 hour. I'll have to create a PowerPoint, which will be an additional 3 hours. So now we have 4 hours for the preparation time for this event. The event itself will be 3 hours, and maybe they're not speaking for 3 hours, but they're asked to be a part of all the session for the entire time. So they are dedicating expertise for that entire time. And then there is some post work for this meeting, and it'll be 1 hour. And so now we have 8 hours total here for this engagement. And so we can pull in here that there was a PowerPoint they were asked to create, and they're asked to give it. There's post engagement work. Here we can look at the interaction mode again, and we can say again the virtual meeting. Here's the travel time portion. I saw some questions about why we recommend 50% here.
We only put that there as a recommended because that is typically what most companies use for healthcare provider compensation, but you can change that to 0. You can change it to whatever you believe is customary for the work that you're doing, for the policies that you have in place within your organization. Some companies have policies on this, and what we learned from the vendor that we worked with, who has a lot of experience with how healthcare providers are compensated, they said that 50% is standard and is recommended in the field, and so we use that, but again, it is not required. That can be adjusted.
Great. And here we have additional travel requirements. Again, this person is a caregiver, so we won't select that, but they may themselves need accompanying medical equipment or travel with a service animal, and special dietary requirements. And actually, now that I am thinking about it, I do believe that we had somebody on the steering committee who said sometimes a caregiver does have caregiver company, so we'll leave that there. Rest breaks needed, special dietary requirements, or other. You can hear again when you're looking at the rate, looking at the lower end of the rate or the higher end of the rate. You can see if this is a risk or liability, wages lost, size of patient organization, care support, urgency needed. And I'll put care support here because maybe they're traveling or maybe they're participating in this event and they need somebody to take care of the person that they support for an amount of time while they're participating in this activity. So here I'll generate a summary again, and here we get the fair market value hourly rate. And I do see some questions about how the levels of expertise are determined. We do have that in the methodology report, but for this one I can tell you we have here caring for someone with the condition and also knowledge about the experience beyond personal experience. So this person does have an intermediate range of knowledge, and because they do have experience with other members of this community, so the fair market value rate is adjusted accordingly.
Now, what the calculator asks you to do is to choose the activity and think about what's the skill set that's required for that activity. So for example, if patients and caregivers are going to be participating in something and the skill set needed is that they have experience with living with disease, that's the skill set that's needed. What is showing up in some of the other things is that when they are expected to do something beyond that, where not only do you want someone who has the skill set of living with the disease, but for example, a patient with the disease might also be an employee of a patient advocacy organization, and in their work, they understand the range of what's known about a population of patients who experience the disease, not just their own personal experience. And so maybe for that particular activity, it would be required that they also know about the larger population of patients and that they are not asked to just speak about their own personal experience living with the disease, but they're asked to talk about other patients also. Some patients experience this, some younger patients, older patients, etc. And so if that's the case, then there is a different level of experience required or additional knowledge that's required. And so that's where, and for that activity, they may be required to have that additional knowledge. That's where we allow that flexibility in there. But if patients generally are patient representatives speaking to their experience with the disease, then that's also an important expertise. And so that you're allowed and have the flexibility to check off which ones make sense for the activity that you're performing.
And I saw a question about how we deal with maybe patients who are, I think, use the term media superstars. So we do in our compensation principles document kind of get into a lot of these questions, what to do when you're contracting or compensating with maybe like a celebrity type of advocate or something similar. So the compensation principles, which is an accompanying document as part of this toolkit, does answer a lot of those kind of questions as well.
Yes, and what we have separated out. So, for example, there are many patient spokespeople who are celebrities. They're known celebrities in sports or entertainment or something like that, but they also happen to have a particular illness or a family member with an illness. And so we've actually said that that is not what this should be used for. That's separate. That's usually really much more used in less of an engagement way and more for a marketing advertising way, and that this compensation calculator does not apply to those circumstances, because in reality, those aren't really patient engagement. That's really a different function.
Great. Would you like me to walk through one more example, or would you like to go through some of the other questions that we have here?
We can certainly go to some of these questions that are in the chat for a minute or two, and then maybe go to, I think JB submitted an example, and I know she's on the line.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
I'm looking through we've kind of gone through some of the examples about expertise, some of the questions about expertise, but yes, I would agree with some of the chat that's here that there is expertise as a patient, and that is usually the one that we're looking for the most. But then there are other kinds of expertise, as we said, that can be added, especially when someone has been a patient representative or a patient advocate for a long time and they have developed additional expertise. You know, we have, someone has asked the question about working with pharma and others to gain alignment. We had, as you saw, the list of sponsors that we worked with on this. Each of those within their company were working with the company individuals, usually compliance, regulatory. We had a number of people who were legal representatives on our committees. And so they were taking this back to their companies and having this be reviewed internally, and gave us a lot of input about how their companies operate, what their processes are, what kinds of review it would have to go through. And so many of the companies said that they have processes in place that are similar to this already, and that one of the things that they would like to do with the calculator like this is be able to use to compare to what they're doing already, and in a way validate that what they're doing is appropriate, and if not, then make some adjustments, or to come back to us and talk about different pieces if they thought there was something that they conflicted with. But for right now, all of the companies that we've been working with have come back and have gone through review internally within their company and found this to be acceptable.
Great. So I know we have JB on the line. So thank you so much for submitting your example yesterday. And I'll start walking through the example that you submitted, but please feel free to stop me if there's if there's something you want to add. Or,
Can you hear me?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Yes. Okay.
Great. So I'll start a new calculation here. And the example that JB sent in was for a patient group representative. Here you go. Let's proceed with selection. We have here designated that it's not a senior leader.
Yeah.
For senior leader in our definition, we have, for example, a CEO, a CMO, or a VP. So this could be someone who maybe is a manager who works for a patient registry or something similar to that.
You know, that was a little bit hard for me to answer because in some of these smaller organizations, you could actually debate whether a person is a senior leader. So some of these organizations where maybe there's just one staff member, but they're not necessarily a senior leader, but they're the only person reporting to the board. So I don't know, in this case, it could probably go either way.
Yeah, I do think that that's one of the pragmatic things that everyone has to enter the data thinking very practically. You know, there's a difference between the person who is the CEO of a $100 million a year international organization as opposed to someone who's the CEO of a one-person organization.
Right.
That's your judgment has to come into play.
Yeah, I mean, like this person to me really is more, she helps with the administration of a largely volunteer-run organization. Right. So.
Yeah.
Thank you. So I do see here that you selected yes for subject matter expertise and yes for skilled in public speaking. And I went into what we defined as subject matter expertise a little bit before, but here we have skilled in public speaking, maybe skilled in addressing a small or large group, addressing the media, expert facilitation or something like that. JB, does this look okay?
Yeah, this looks okay. I mean, to me, when I answered those questions, like, I felt like if somebody ever came to me and asked me to justify those things, like I could pull up examples. So for example, is this person a dynamic speaker that you could see doing a keynote at a Congress? No, but could I point to several examples of where she has done public speaking? Yes. So just trying to be pragmatic about it.
And that's really a big part of what the tool is about. It's to help you document why you made the choices that you made, and that you weren't gaming the system in order to pay the person a specific amount. It was that you actually had honest answers for each of these things that practically make sense, and that's how you got to a very fair decision about the compensation.
Yeah, because in my experience, everywhere I've worked, we've had some sort of FMV process, and a lot of it is about the documentation and can you like back up all of these different attributes of fair market value.
Right. I just wanted to jump in. Someone asked a question earlier about do we differentiate between individual patients and the people who work for patient advocacy organizations in terms of patient advocacy organization staff acting as a individual patient because they also happen to have the disease. From our perspective in this calculator and from all the conversations that we had with all of the groups involved, we do differentiate. And so if an individual works for a patient advocacy organization as an employee, not as a volunteer, but as an employee, then they should be, the compensation should be made to their organization and not to the individual because of the conflict of interest issues that are present there. And so if someone has the disease and they work for the organization and they are an employee of that organization, their compensation should go to the company. If they are an individual, they are not employed by the organization, they may be a volunteer, they may be just participate in volunteer activities with that organization, but they are not an employee, then they should be compensated individually as an individual patient advocate.
Mm-hmm. And they should also have the right to decline compensation, right?
And that is also in our principles, that patients have the right to decline compensation. There are some people who could potentially lose their benefits that they have. It may be healthcare benefits, disability type benefits. They lose their benefits by being compensated. And so they can have the option to choose that they want to decline their payment. But again, it should be something that's well documented, very clear, and that the patient was given the choice and that that choice wasn't made for them.
Mm-hmm.
Here I'll go to the next part of the activity timetable. And JB, I think there wasn't a specific activity you were looking at, but if you'd like to tell me one, I'll scroll through it slowly so you can let me know which one.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. So for this, it was a presentation speaker testimonial was the closest thing to it. And so what's the first? So the actual event would be 1 hour. The prep time would be 1 hour. And can you go back up? I'll look at the other host activities, 0 hours. Travel hour right now, 0 hours. It's actually, so it's 3 events.
Great. Okay, so we have 6 hours here as the total. Just so you all know, we do have an other category. So for some reason, there's not something on this list that's close to what you'd like. We do have other here, so you could designate that. But in forming the activities list in this activities timetable, we did go through quite a bit of, we went through with our interviews, all of the interactions that people had done before with patients and patient groups. So here I'll just do prep work, testimonial, and then there's no patient post-engagement work. And I think you said this was a virtual meeting.
Yes. Web, it could be like whatever a Zoom meeting would be on here. Yeah.
Yeah. And here you can designate multiple ones because when you're on the activities timetable, you can have multiple activities. So you could have an in-person event, but you also want to have several virtual meetings.
Your prep may be, all your prep may be on telephone. So that's like a very common scenario is that you do all of your prep and your training on the phone or WebEx for an in-person event. So that's good.
Great. And then, so we don't have any mileage or incidental expenses or anything like that. And then do you have any, well, there's no additional travel requirements for this section, but maybe modifiers that you may have, such as wages lost or risk or liability?
Well, I think maybe size of patient organization, actually, because she's like the only person. So, I mean, obviously her wages aren't going to be lost, but, you know, it is consideration that it takes away from her time to do a lot of her core responsibilities within the organization. You know, maybe, yes, patient organization, sole employee.
Great. And that will show up in the notes on the summary report, which is nice. So you can look at it again later.
I think I could document that, right? Like I could show it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so then again, you can put your information here. So if you're working, you know, for an organization and you submit it, you can save it like that with all the information you need.
Email it to me, Ilka.
Got it.
There's some conversation going on in the chat about patients not just being tick boxes, and I think philosophically we're all in the same place. We absolutely believe that patients are not just tick boxes. I think the difficulty that we've been dealing with in the past is that there's a perception that in these activities patients don't need to be paid, or that it's inappropriate to pay them, or that they don't have to be paid as much as other experts need to be paid. And the purpose behind this is to help ensure that the organizations that should be compensating patients for their time and expertise are doing so, and they're doing so appropriately. So could not agree more. We absolutely believe that they are not just tick boxes. I would also say that this is US based, and so in some countries there may very well be regulatory legal reasons why patients can't be paid. We do put a disclaimer in here saying that everyone should refer to state and local government to make these determinations as is applicable. I will also tell you that I have dealt with many companies in the US who have told me that they legally are not allowed to pay patients. And I have gone back to them and told them that that's legal baloney, and that law does not exist, and that they should be paying patients. And so sometimes some organizations will try to hide behind legal, and I'm not saying that that's true in the case that was presented in the chat. I'm just saying I've seen that happen. And so in order to really stand up for patients and be sure that engagement is happening, and it's happening in a meaningful way, in an appropriate way, but that also patients' expertise is being recognized, that's an important thing for us to do. And that's one of the things that we think that this calculator can help with.
So, Eleanor and Silka, I just want to, for a moment, share with the group how I would work with the discrepancy, because I saw that there was questions in the chat about, wow, that's a really large range, right? So in my current situation, I'm standing up a whole patient advocacy function, and I'm in the process of developing these different policies and bringing our leadership around. And so we're at the point now, and this has been common in most of the places where I've worked. And for those who don't know me, I do work in industry, so I'll just put that out there. That they've arrived at an FMV number that they think is appropriate for patients and patient advocates. And so what I would do is I would look at this range and say, and go to our general counsel and say, okay, here's, based on this FMV calculation, this falls within the range of what we're thinking about, and I would apply that number, right? So this is 6 hours. And so I'm just going to give an example. I'm not going to say exactly what we're doing, but if we were paying $100 an hour for patient advocates, then I would say, okay, here's the range in the FMV calculator, and our number is within that range. So that's how I would use this right now.
Yeah. I also want to point out that in the chat, Berkeley Phillips, the comment that you've made, your comment is directly in alignment with with our thinking, that it is the activity that drives the skills needed. And it's the skills needed for that activity that drives what tick boxes you check here to get to the compensation range. So you really need to and you proceed accordingly. So it's not like you begin with, oh, I have a person that I want to bring in and they have these skills, therefore I will check these boxes. The skills required should be aligned with the activity you are asking them to perform. And that's one of the ways that we would like to get to where the compensation is fair, because it recognizes the activity that and the skill that was required for that activity. And it's perfectly okay for the skill to be, this person needs to have, this person needs to be a patient who has lived with the disease and knows what it's like to live with that disease. That's the skill that's required.
Or newly diagnosed even.
Or it could be newly diagnosed. It could be someone who's newly diagnosed. It could be somebody who has gone through various stages of a disease. We're looking for somebody who actually understands those stages of the disease. That's an expertise that we need. It could be someone who not has the disease and has had to try 3, 4, 5 treatments in order for them to find something that works for them, or gone through 5 treatments and still doesn't have. I mean, you can make that as refined as you need for the situation that's at hand. There is some discussion also about payments to the patient organization versus payments to the individual. We, as the National Health Council, have standards of excellence that our patient advocacy organization members must abide by. And in those standards, we have 3 different standards that refer to conflict of interest. And we really do believe that if an individual is an employee receiving a salary from an organization, they are in conflict if they try to do work that is related to their job, and they try to do it individually, independently, get paid for it separately. So the example I would give you is I work for the National Health Council. I am an employee. I get a salary from the National Health Council. Very often, pharmaceutical companies will ask me to come in and do training, workshops, speaking, other kinds of collaborations. I do not get paid individually. The payment goes to the National Health Council. It would be in conflict for me to be picking and choosing which ones I will do work for individually and get money to myself, as opposed to which ones would pay the National Health Council. It's kind of an inappropriate choice. I do this as my job, therefore I go out and do that with the companies as part of my job, and the money goes to the National Health Council. Now, if I'm a volunteer, I'm not getting paid by the National Health Council or by any other organization. I am volunteering my time, and a company asks me to do something. I can go there as a patient advocate, speak to my expertise, but I don't speak as someone representing that organization. I'm not employed by them. I might say that I volunteer for them, that I do work with them, but I don't represent them. I would be there representing myself. JB, anything else that you want to add to your example that you had going on here? Helpful to you?
Yeah, no, it's definitely helpful. It's just a guide. It's nice to have something, especially as you're developing, policies in an organization. I mean, we may not, our process may end up being more simple than this. I'm just looking at the sheet I filled out and sent you. So I'll know if there's anything else I could raise.
And the worksheet was a guide. It obviously had all of the things that could be on, could be as an expertise level or something that could pop up with any type of participant. So it does include questions about treatment experience, whereas if you ask a patient group representative, you probably wouldn't necessarily want someone with treatment experience, because that's not the type of activity that you're asking them to do. Even if they do have the condition, then if you did want someone to talk about the condition, you would be asking them as a patient rather than a patient group representative. So the worksheet is helpful, I think, to kind of focus what expertise level you're looking for and the type of activity and participant. But of course, the actual calculator will tailor it kind of as you walk through.
Yeah, I think for, you know, for our needs, what we just want to make sure is that when we do engagements and if we're paying patients or patient advocates, that we can document, you know, how we arrived at ours. First of all, like how we're doing our tiering with FMV. And then the second piece of it is documenting each engagement, like why you chose who you chose, like what were the objectives you were trying to achieve, and then narrowing those expertise, so to speak. And so I think this even provides probably a little more detail than like what I'll have in our process. I think that where I see us be able to use this is just to occasionally run this and make sure it's aligned with where we are. And also because this is a tool that's widely available to the patient community, right? And so the patient community, as they think about like what their expectations are for when they do engagements, can also, there's that level of transparency with it.
I also wanted to ask Matthew, could we unmute Matthew so that he might be able to talk about the table developed by Paradigm and how it can complement the calculator?
Good afternoon. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can, Matthew.
So, yeah. First of all, great work on this tool. It's extremely nice to see how much progress you made on the last year. So in Paradigm, we developed and we adapted from UPATI a table of competencies that could really help everyone engaging patient and patient representatives to really define the competence in a series of attributes. And then this could help you guys to identify the right match to really engage. And once you have the right match, based on the competence, which is based on the activity, then you can use the tool to plug the fair market value. And I think everything here is going in the same direction, and it's really nice to see actually. Just put a Dropbox because our tool is still in public consultation. It was presented yesterday at a session yesterday afternoon, but it's really nice to complement the work streams. Yeah.
That's great, and we can and when it's completed, we can put the link to in the toolbox that we have so that they're linked together, and people know that the resource is available.
Yeah, that would be great. Great.
Right. I also wanted to address, there were some questions that had come up about smaller organizations that may not have a lot of staff and their volunteers represent them, or board members. So I think in those situations, we have actually in our compensation principles and our interpretation guide that those are places where there may be gray areas. But if the organization has a policy in place, and that's probably the most important thing, is that organizations, patient organizations, and pharmaceutical companies have policies in place for this. So if you are a patient organization that has circumstances where you do encourage your volunteers or to speak for you as a representative of your organization, then you would have policies in place where that individual could be compensated as a volunteer or as a staff member because of the specific circumstances. So we don't believe that there is a hard line, but we do believe that most organizations, especially the ones that are a little bit larger and have a staff that does a lot of consultation and those kinds of things, that there should be a separation there and that there should be conflict of interest addressed. But we understand that there will be circumstances where policies can cover those kinds of issues very easily. Just be sure that you have something written down. I think from my perspective, most organizations that we deal with, large and small, they would feel uncomfortable with someone going out and speaking and claiming to speak on behalf of their organization if they were not an employee. But there are circumstances where they would give someone permission to go out and speak on behalf of their organization and state they're doing so because of their own individual circumstances. So completely in agreement, but I'm just giving you the range of possibilities, and that there should be policies that everyone covers with that. I want to actually turn now, if we could, Silke, go back perhaps to our slide presentation so that we can start to begin to do some wrap up here. Matthew, thank you for jumping in.
I think we covered some of these interpretations.
I think we have covered quite a bit of this as we were
Yeah.
going through examples. Just to the interpretation of results. So there are some things that you might want to think about when you're looking at the range, because it can sometimes be a large range. The risk of liability. So for example, one of the things that we got back when we had this out for beta testing in January from all the testers was that there may be, you may need to compensate people because of the amount of pressure that you're putting on them when there's legal or financial implications. So for example, if someone's part of a data safety monitoring board, there may be some liability issues, there may be some added stress there. There may be wages lost if someone is going to do this, and so you may want to take that into consideration. So it is not recommended that you directly compensate people for their wages lost, but you may want to consider that in interpreting the range. And then urgency. Sometimes someone's input might be needed in a very short time frame. You're asking them to maybe drop everything and concentrate on something for several days. And in order for that deadline to be met, there may be a reason for giving them a little bit of extra compensation because you're putting added pressure on them. So these are kinds of things that you might want to consider as you're doing your interpretation of the findings to help guide you to whether you're in the lower end of the range or the higher end of the range. Next slide, please. So we went through the examples that were submitted, and using it on your own. So we're making it available at the NHC website, and that will be we've had it up for testing for a few days. We're still working on that, and we expect by next week it'll be fully operational. So if you're out there trying it in the next few days, you might find one or two glitches because it's just been newly put up for today, so that we can meet the deadline for today to be able to show it to you. And I would like to actually take a pause here and turn back to Nicholas so that we could talk a little bit about the future, because one of the things that's been planned for the FMV calculator is that that PFMD would become involved in doing an adaptation of the FMV calculator for use in the EU. And of course, as you will all see, and there's been many comments in the chat about adaptation for the EU. It will take some time to get the salary data and all the kinds of inputs that need to go into it. But I want to just stop here. And Nicola, would you want to jump in and make some comments about what we're thinking about for the future? Because I think we're still in the planning stages. There isn't a defined plan just yet, but we certainly want to hear from people about what kinds of things they would need. And I think we've captured a lot in the chat about what the concerns might be. So Nicola, I want to turn it over to you for a few minutes.
Thanks, Eleanor. And indeed, we have seen a lot of the questions that we will have to address in the chat already. So just maybe to come back on the overall approach, it's really important to look at the calculator, not just as the calculator that's giving a range, but also at how to define the criteria. Matthew mentioned the matrix that actually comes very well together with it, and they are built on the same criteria. It's just a different way to look at it. But it's very important to see first that how you get to the price range is actually how you shape also the type of patient you need around the table, the type of expertise or the type of experience you want around the table. And actually that's even before we get to the numbers, the fact that you really structure your approach to it and the fact that you acknowledge that you would put a price on that is a very important drive to change the mindset. And that's even more important than the calculator itself. So I just wanted to insist on that. And so we will take all of that. And actually the idea is to keep a coherent approach to bring that to other regions, starting with Europe, where we'll have to get to the national level. And indeed, there are some very specific questions. Legal aspect locally might be very different in some countries in Europe. The rates also different country per country. So how we will factor that is actually one of the next phase. So what we have in mind is that we will we are launching this right now, US driven, and we'll see what are all the questions that are coming and that it's raising actually when people, and I think we have seen the key topics already in the chat. And that's for Q3, and then in Q4, we will define a localization strategy. We already have a project that we call the country cards, and the idea is really to separately from the calculator to define what are the local constraints. Can you hire a patient organization? Can you hire patients to perform some support in any way? So that's not the same in each country, and we just want to link that to the work we have done on reference contracts. And so basically what you can do or not, even before you get to the pricing. And then depending on the feasibility and the granularity needed, we will roll out the calculator in different countries. And that will be most probably for early next year. So that's basically how we are looking at the planning right now. There will be a co-creation phase. So if you have interest in contributing, please contact us. Yeah, we can share in the chat. I will share in the chat just after the email where you can contact us. Or join us via the channel that you know already. The point is to co-create the next step. So we are not about to do that in a black box. We are working, we will be in touch with with all the players of Paradigm, with the FPR patient think tank. So all of that, all of these entities and people will be involved. If you are not part of these and still want to contribute, please contact us. The last thing I wanted to do, and it's exactly as per the contract approach, it's a reference. It doesn't mean that you have to stick to it super precisely. It's a reference. That's also why the price range is what it is. So it's important to see that as a way to help drive change. It doesn't mean that you have to stick to it like 100%. So that's really important to make that, because we know that there will be some specific situation that you have to adapt to. We completely understand that. So it's not a new law on price range and compensation. It's actually a reference to help the entire community, whatever stakeholder group we are talking about. That's it. I have nothing else to add unless there are some specific questions. Thank you very much, Eleonore.
Thank you. Silke, you want to go to the next slide? And we also had a request to post the link in the chat. So would you also do that so people have access to the link? If you go to the next slide. So we would, of course, welcome your feedback. As I said, we've had it up just for a few days as we've been getting it up there and testing it and trying to be sure that we're getting all the glitches out of it. I'm sure that in the next few days we'll find some more. You know how that goes when something is so new, but we're hoping, at least here in the US, we have the national holiday next week, so that it will be a slow use while we're going through the dry run on it, and that for after the holiday we'll be fully up and ready to roll. But it is there, and Silke will post the link in the chat for you. And then any comments or any questions that come up, any glitches that you find, please by all means send us a note and let us know about that. It'd be very important for us to be addressing those as quickly as possible. The other thing I wanted to, could you go to the next slide, please, Silke? The other thing I also wanted you to know about is in terms of the contracting. So we have the contract templates that were developed by WeCan, PFMD, and we are working with a law firm here in the US to take those templates and to adapt them for US use. They are not ready yet, but they will be released this summer, and we will be adding those to the toolkit later this summer. So again, another way that we're sharing this collaboration between the US and EU colleagues, so that we are taking the work that got done on that side, adapting it for US, the same way that PFMD will be taking what we did on the US side and adapting it for EU use. So look forward to seeing those. I'm hopeful that at some point later this year, we'll be able to show those to you in another open forum. And then also we have some trainings, and Silka also indicated in the chat that we will be having some trainings that will be happening on the FMV calculator. For anybody who might want to participate in a training, you can go to the website. We have 2 dates there. So you're going to have to be the one who tells everyone, because I can't remember what they are off the top of my head. But we have 2 dates there where training is scheduled, and people can sign up for that training. It's all free. And again, thank you to